Welcome everyone. Good afternoon to those of you on East Africa time and good morning to everybody else. Welcome to our first event in this series from Share Screen Africa. My name is CL Vaughan and I work with Share Screen Africa. We facilitate virtual events to bring experts into classrooms from all over Africa. And we are hosting this series in collaboration with the African Wildlife Economies Institute. The title of the series is Exploring East Africa's Wildlife Economy, which is exactly what we plan to do through our series of events. This is the first one in the series titled Dialogue 1, Wild Foods. And I would like to welcome our speaker today, our primary speaker, Richard Vigne, and also our facilitator / co-speaker, Dr. Wiseman Ndlovu. So thanks very much for joining us, everyone. I hope this is going to be a very interesting and lively discussion. So I'm going to hand over to our facilitator now. Wiseman, thank you.
Thank you very much, Silly, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I'm aware that we are all situated in different parts of the world with different time zones. Here is still in the morning. So good morning and welcome to our first series of the 6, which we are focusing on exploring East Africa wildlife economies. And as Silly has already introduced today, who is joining me to have this conversation is Richard. So my name is Ndlovu Wiseman. As already indicated, I'm with the African Wildlife Economy Institute, and I work there as a postdoc and also as a programs manager for the institute. So I'll be taking you through the conversation together with Richard today. So our series are organized into 6. I've already mentioned that. So part of these topics today, we are starting with the wild foods. And the second one, which will be on the following Thursday, it will be on wild oils. That is on the 23rd of May. On the 30th, we'll also have a conversation looking into wild fuels. What type of fuels are utilized in East Africa? And also look on the fourth one will be on wild carbon. That is on the 6th of June. And we're also going to close with the wild use tourism. So these are the 6 of the series that we are going to delve into and the topics that are going to help us to unpack the East Africa wildlife economies. So I would like to also indicate that we'll be happy to hear you introducing yourselves. Maybe you can simply just write a note on the chat box there to introduce, say who you are, where you are from, and also perhaps indicate your area of specialization. That would be interesting to also to note, so that we can also learn from your experiences or even contact you at a later stage. So without taking much of your time, I would like to also indicate that we are going to have a more of a conversation. So everyone should feel free to raise comments either on the chat box or raise their hands and also ask the questions directly to the speaker. Without taking much of your time, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us, and I will give Richard an opportunity to introduce himself and lay the foundation for this talk, and then we'll have a conversation thereafter. Richard, over to you.
Hi, everybody. I know a few of you, but not all. Malta, Hillary, hi. Good to see you, and thanks for taking the time to join. Can you see my screen, first and foremost?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, perfect. So I guess what I want to do first and foremost is just to introduce myself. Just give me a second or two while I sort myself out. Hang on a second. Right, that's better. So I am Kenyan. I ran a place called the Old Pejida Conservancy in Laikipia for a long period of time. Prior to that, I've worked all over East Africa and Central Africa doing consultancies and other pieces of work. And I now am the executive director of an institution called the School of Wildlife Conservation, which is a faculty of the African Leadership University. And we're a Pan-African organization. We are not a school that is typically, it's not a typical wildlife school. We don't focus on things like protected area management or ecology or that kind of stuff. We're much more focused on what we call the business of conservation. And very roughly, that is translated as How do we transform the natural assets of Africa into an economic opportunity for the continent? So just a bit of background. This won't come as anything new to most of you who are here. What's the state of conservation at the moment? We all know it's underfunded. We all know that it's the biodiversity loss that is currently being experienced by the planet is a significant threat to humanity. Some people would say it's one of the top 3 threats faced by humanity, including nuclear war and the threat posed by climate change. And some people would say that it's a greater threat than the threat of nuclear war. And we all know also that the funding required to recover biodiversity, the so-called to achieve the ambitions of the Kunming-Montreal Accord, which was signed a couple of years ago, will need massive amounts of funding. And right now, only around about 16% of that funding is available to us. So what does it all mean? It means that we have to find new ways of conserving. It means that we have to change the paradigm that has existed in our world of conservation for so many years, because the truth of the matter is, it hasn't been successful. But that said, there are successful examples where conservation, where the stewardship of the environment is happening at scale within Africa. And I think the opportunities presented by wild food can contribute significantly to further success, and we need to build upon some of the successful examples that we have. So I always like to use this slide. I think one of the ways of defining how we're moving forwards in conservation is by looking at where we used to be, which was often the sort of traditional approach of protecting nature from people. So thinking of national parks with big fences, where people were excluded, where their livestock were excluded, with wildlife retained within the national parks, heavily protected, and a clear separation between the two. And I think what's happening in conservation is we're moving to this, which is about protecting fauna and flora for people rather than protecting fauna and flora from people. And what does that imply? It implies to me, anyway, that we need to find sustainable methods to live with and manage our natural assets, as opposed to simply preventing any kind of sustainable utilization of the same. And of course, when we talk about that, wild food is a massive category and a potentially huge opportunity, not only for Africa, but for the globe as a whole. The other, very quickly, slide I always like to show is this one, which is from a report that many of you will be familiar with. It's called the Dasgupta report, and it shows what's happened on this planet over the last 40-odd, 50-odd years. And very simply, what it shows is that produced capital, so that stuff that we humans produce, buildings, vehicles, whatever you want to call it, plus human capital, which is human populations, have both grown, but they've grown significantly at the expense of a significant decrease in natural capital. And it's that, at least at the school and in this conversation, that we are aiming to reverse. We want, obviously, to meet the needs of humans. That's going to be very important and can't be ignored, but we need to find a way of doing it in a manner that doesn't exhaust ultimately natural capital, but in fact also acts to start rebuilding natural capital. And again, I would say sustainable exploitation of wild resources, food amongst others, is a very good way of thinking about how that could begin to happen. So really what we're talking about is how we place a value on nature into everything that we do. And I think some of the new models that are evolving are beginning to do that. And that's probably a conversation that we can have at some other time. But I guess as we get into the subject of wild food as a kind of facet to all of this, I think it's worth just pointing out some of the incredible ironies that we see within the way that natural resources are managed. And I'm going to now focus upon Africa. This is a picture of a sailfish caught off the coast of Kenya. It's an iconic marine beast. And it's perfectly legal for sport fishermen to come to Kenya, to fish off the coast of Kenya and to kill these animals amongst others. Nobody even bats an eyelid. And yet in Kenya, technically speaking, it's illegal to hunt or to consumptively utilize wildlife. So for some reason, we don't see the ocean as part of Kenya. And in fact, that's just an interesting aside, but most of Africa lies underneath the oceans if you look at marine jurisdictions. But we don't seem to sort of think about that. I'm allowed to go fishing in the highlands of Kenya for wild living animals, fish, trout, whatever they are, but I'm not allowed to hunt guinea fowl for meat. So there's a lot of inconsistencies that sit across the way we as Africans manage our natural resources. And of course, what that means ultimately is that we tend to be very inefficient. And more importantly, the way we manage tends to be unsustainable as a result. But I'm going to just, before we open this up to a conversation, give you some interesting statistics. First of all, I want to talk about wild meat and the wild meat business. I'm focusing a little bit on Eastern Africa because that's the area I'm most familiar with, but I'll talk about other parts of Africa at the same time. There are studies, recent studies, that show that 7 in 10 Kenyans eat wild meat, and yet the consumption of wild meat in Kenya is theoretically completely banned. But it's obviously something that is relied upon by 70% of the population for their sustenance. In Central Africa, 80% of protein intake is from wild meat. It's a massively important and critical, it's massively important resource that is critical for security and nutrition. I think it's true to say that where policy, law, and very importantly, land tenure arrangements align, wildlife actually can thrive with all types of consumptive use. And here I'm including all, there are various definitions of consumptive use depending upon the circumstances, depending upon the jurisdiction within which one is operating, from cropping through to game ranching through to sport hunting. The truth of the matter is the logic behind the bans around consumptive use have rarely been shown to work, whereas where consumptive use is allowed, regulated, and where land tenure arrangements are suitable for it to exist in a sustainable way, it's tend to have had the opposite effect. In other words, wildlife populations have either remained stable or increased. A lot of people argue against the consumption of wild meat because of the risk of zoonotic disease transmissions. I would argue that actually where you have a ban and where, in fact, wild meat continues to be consumed, as evidenced by what is happening among 70% of Kenyans, you drive the trade underground. You are therefore unable to regulate it. In other words, for example, meat is not inspected as it would be if it was a legally managed industry, and that opens up more opportunity for zoonotic disease transmission than you would get in a properly regulated legal trade in wild meat, which is found in other parts of Africa. The other thing that I think is important is that there's good evidence to suggest, and there's many examples of this, where it can be demonstrated that wild ungulates are very, very effective users of rangeland resources and far more efficient than the domestic livestock, such as cattle, sheep, and goats, which we have come to rely upon for our sources of protein. They're physiologically better adapted to some of the sort of harsher conditions. They have better disease resistance. They make better use of poor quality vegetation. They have superior reproductive rates in arid conditions in particular, and growth rates as well. And it can also be shown that game meat is nutritionally superior in many instances when compared to other forms of livestock. It tends to have less fat, and it tends to have more amounts of edible protein per unit of live weight. So there's very few arguments in my mind which should prevent the emergence of a vibrant, sustainable trade or production system and trade in wild meat across Africa. But as we know, based in East Africa, particularly Kenya, but also other parts of Africa, this is not something that is understood or seen by governments, to sometimes huge detriment to our wildlife populations. Let me talk briefly about wild plants, if I could. So 7 out of 10 people worldwide make use of what are referred to as indigenous wild edible plants on a daily basis. So I'm going to refer to the acronym there as, which is IWEPS, to make it easier for me to go through this. And around about 26,000 plants globally have been shown to have medicinal properties. I know that's not about consumption per se, but it's linked. And also, we know that 60% of Africa's diet is based on three plant sources, being maize, wheat, and rice. So the opportunity to diversify, again sustainably, the diets of Africans to improve their quality in the process by making use of wild harvested plants is, I think, pretty obvious in some of these statistics that I'm presenting. But what's interesting, and this has been shown again in many instances, is there's a lot of stigma often attached with the use of wild plants, IWEPs. And you can imagine that that person doesn't have a farm; they have to go and forage in the bush to get their food. That's the kind of stigma that I'm talking about, and it's in many people's estimations a real barrier to the long-term production and sustainable use of wild plants. The other thing that is a major impediment and this applies to wild meat as much as it applies to wild plants, are that the laws to support a commercial approach to the use of wild plants across Africa are often inadequate. And probably as importantly, the cost to penetrate, particularly international markets, and here I'm thinking about things like baobab and other plants, are often incredibly prohibitive. It's very expensive to get into those markets for all sorts of reasons around which are sort of regulatory in nature. The other, I think, major impediment, and this is something that's been made clear by various international conservation organizations, is that you can't effectively manage what you can't measure. I think it was a guy called Peter Drucker who said that. And we don't really know often what the conservation status of many of the wild plants that we use is. We know some of them are endangered. We know some of them are overexploited. Some of them are unsustainably used, but we don't really know. And until such time as we get a better grip of that, it becomes difficult to find, or to at least argue for, their sustainable use and the expansion of their use on a commercial basis going forwards. So there's a definite need for the development internationally of standards that could be applied to govern the use of plants in particular, but also probably meat. And some other considerations before I stop. Sorry, I've gone back. Hang on a second. International approaches we've talked about. So these are the things that are going to have to be put into place. I've mentioned that just a moment or two ago. Anything we do clearly has to be sustainable, but it's difficult to be sustainable where you have commonly owned resources, particularly where they move across land tenure arrangements, and that happens a lot in Africa, but it also happens probably unseen in many respects, but definitely across the marine areas of Africa, which, as I've said, are actually, if you combine them all, are bigger than Africa itself. Where you have secure land tenure, that helps to permit long-term planning and investment. Where you don't have secure land tenure, clearly the incentives are aligned to exploit rather than to invest and to build. And I think that's critical. But it's not just about the on-paper land tenure arrangements that are in place. It's about the actual practical implementation of those land tenure arrangements. So across northern Kenya, you'll see areas which call themselves conservancies, but in a practical sense, they often don't have much control over how those areas are used and how those areas are managed. And that becomes a real issue in terms of creating opportunities for sustainable use of wild resources. The issue of human health and the potential for zoonotic transmission, clearly seen what happened with COVID, and other viruses which have emerged over the last 20, 30, 40 years. It's definitely something that has to be safeguarded against. But again, I would make the point that if we are able to allow the emergence of a trade, if we're able to regulate it effectively, if we're able to draw it out, particularly in the case of Kenya, but other countries as well, from the kind of underground prohibited space that it currently exists in, then the opportunity to regulate in exactly the same way that we inspect domestic meat before we consume it becomes much more of an opportunity. And two final points. The one about removing stigma, clearly that's a communication issue that will have to be addressed if we're going to be successful at raising the profile of wild foods. But I think the other one that is really worth exploring and thinking about is the opportunity for value add. This is clearly controversial, not so much with regard to plants, but we as Africa, and this applies to many of our products, export raw products. We very rarely take the steps to value add and confer more value within Africa to ourselves than otherwise is normally the case. And that can be seen in a variety of different products. So value adding, particularly with regard to wild plants, but also potentially with wild meat for export, is something that presents a massive opportunity, could begin to close that gap that I talked about at the beginning in terms of the resources that are lacking in order to achieve our conservation and sustainability objectives as a continent, and to wean ourselves off what in many cases is an almost total reliance upon philanthropic incomes. So that is something that's got to be taken seriously. And I would add into that mix the issue of sport hunting, because sport hunting, whilst controversial, whilst banned in many places, is in fact a value add mechanism. What it does is it adds value to the consumptive process. And if it's properly regulated and controlled, should be something that is taken seriously. So I just want to finish very quickly by bringing your attention to what we refer to as our Wildlife Economy Investment Index. This is produced by the School of Wildlife Conservation Research team. And it's worth looking up on our website, but it ranks individual countries in terms of their wildlife asset and in terms of their investability. And what I think is interesting in this is some of those countries, and I'm highlighting Kenya, but others, which have a great reputation for conservation, actually are not ranked as highly as other countries where consumptive use is a properly embedded mechanism for the sustainable management of particularly wildlife, but also wild plants. And I think there's a lesson in that. And I'm not for a moment suggesting that this index I mean, we think it's robust and we'll continue to improve it. But I think it's beginning to tell a story. And I would argue that if countries want to move up the index, then that whole notion of using every tool that is available to us to ensure that there is a reason for people to want to conserve and manage wildlife has to be explored, and then really nothing can be left on the table. So let me stop there. I hope I've provoked a few thoughts, and I'll hand over to Wise.
Thank you very much, Richard, for that insightful talk. And it was great to hear about the developments, the potential, and what is currently happening in the East, and what we could possibly explore. I can also see that we have been joined by a lot of people from different parts of Africa, including Benin, Mozambique, and some from Southern Africa. Thank you very much for joining us. So now we are going to have a conversation with Richard. So I'll ask a few questions, and also feel free to drop your questions. You can raise your hand. You can also drop them on the chat box. So looking into wild foods, back to you, Richard. Looking into wild foods exist in many different forms. It comes in the form of fruits, from roots, from meat, and many other aspects that you will find in the bush. So the question that I have for you is, looking into the East Africa region, what are typical wild foods that we can actually talk about, and those that are currently consumed and those with at least a potential in the market?
I mean, I think Wise, your question is difficult to answer. It's very difficult to answer briefly, and the reason I say that is because in East Africa, and I'm here including some parts of Central Africa, there are many different approaches to the management of our natural resources, in particular wildlife and wild plants. And it depends, I think, on the regions that you're talking about, and it depends upon many different variables and factors. If I can just talk about Kenya quickly and then move on to one or two other countries. In Kenya, technically speaking, all wildlife, I'm here talking about animals, but I think it's also inclusive of plants that exist. I can't remember exactly how the definition goes, but let's just talk about wild animals for the purpose of this conversation. All of them belong to the government. And actually, that's the same in many other African countries. But Kenya is different from many countries in that the consumptive use of wild animals used to be allowed. Then there was a ban on sport hunting in the 1970s. And then what was known as culling or cropping was reintroduced in the 90s through to the early 2000s. And then subsequently, again, it was banned. So what that means is that if in Kenya, if you're we used to be able to consumptively use many different species of wildlife, and it was a protein source for reasonably significant parts of the population. There were value-add opportunities, for example, zebra hides being tanned hereon for various different products, and so on and so forth. And it provided a reason for people to particularly people owning large tracts of land, to want to continue to persist and exist with wildlife, to tolerate it. The moment it was banned, it was then taken to huge extremes. So right now in Kenya, as I was trying to talk about earlier, there used to be a thriving bird hunting. I'm here talking about game bird hunting. I wouldn't call it an industry, but it happened in many different parts of the country. And it provided a reason for it. It provided an income for farmers. It provided a method to control bird populations, at least to some extent. That has also been removed. So in Kenya, you've got this weird situation where really consumption of wildlife doesn't theoretically exist, yet we know it does exist because of the statistics that I gave you at the beginning, which is that 7 out of 10 Kenyans consume wild meat. And when it comes to wild plants, again, depending on the region, there are many different plants that are exploited depending on who you are and where you live. And there are too many to list. So the point I'm trying to make is it happens even though theoretically it's banned. But most importantly, the wildlife populations of Kenya continue to decrease, not increase. If you go to Tanzania, you've got a whole different situation there where they're trying actively to encourage game ranching with some success, but in other cases, not much success. And I think you have to look at the reasons for that. Are the value add opportunities sufficient? Can you make sufficient money off your land from consumptive use of wildlife as opposed to keeping livestock? What are the economic incentives and disincentives that are lined up for people? So that goes back to my point around land tenure to some extent, but also the regulatory and policy environment that exists. So there is usage in Tanzania, but it doesn't necessarily result in all places in sort of stable or burgeoning, growing, sustainably managed wildlife populations. And then you go to somewhere like the Congo, where frankly there is very little control of anything, and most people live off wild meat, and that can include anything. And it's totally unregulated, but it's a significant part of society. It's openly traded in the markets of places like Kinshasa. And that's the other extreme. So you've got a variety of different situations happening, is what I would say. And the potential to introduce a regulatory environment and sensible laws that allow the commercialization of the sustainable use of wild plants and animals definitely exists in theory. The problem is how you persuade governments to change those laws to allow it to happen in practice, and then how do you measure and evaluate your performance in terms of how your wildlife populations are doing. And I think those are really tricky things, but if you look to South Africa, there's lots of good examples of how that can happen and has happened over previous years, to the point that their wildlife populations, albeit ranched or whatever, are growing and not shrinking. So I think there's some really important lessons. I'm not sure I've completely answered the question, but at least I've pointed out some of the differences.
Yeah, thanks for that, Richard. Yes, you did answer the question. It would also be nice that you also give examples if you have some of the commonly consumed plants in the Eastern African region, perhaps in Rwanda or in Tanzania or in Kenya or in Somalia, some of those that perhaps you will find in the local markets that people are consuming, or those that are also starting to make inroads into formal value chains. If we can also hear around that, what is the industry looking like? Are there wild foods, whether be it leaves, be it meat, be
Sure.
it roots or fruits? Are there products or wild products that are starting to make their way into the formal market? And also to the audience, it would be nice also to just highlight on the chat box if you have some examples of the foods that you're consuming from the wild, from your region or from the area you come from. You can just drop them there. Would be happy to learn about that. Over to you, Richard.
Sure. Well, I mean, Wise, we all eat wild food. Think of honey or termites, or there's a very good examples now in Kenya, beginning to be examples of seaweed farming for export to Europe as a health food. There's increasing examples of, again, this is in the marine environment, which is the bit I find so peculiar in Kenya. There's farming, octopus farming, there is crab farming, there is use of marine resources of all types, from sea cucumbers through to sailfish, through to some of the bigger sort of megafauna that inhabit the marine environments, often for consumption in the tourism industry, but increasingly consumed by populations who don't live along the coastline. So there's a lot of that is happening, and it's legal until you go inland, where suddenly it's illegal to harvest wild things. But of course, it's happening. I talked about honey, and there's I'm trying to think of some of the names of the plants that people use. But most people will harvest plants of various types to supplement their daily diets where they're able to do so. If you go to some places in Nairobi, you can still buy crocodile meat and ostrich meat, but they come from crocodile and ostrich farms. So in the legal marketplaces, you won't find much. What you'll find is beef, sheep, and sort of domestically grown vegetables that you would find in a supermarket. Again, in complete contrast to what you would find in the supermarket in South Africa, for example, where you would find all types of wild meat and various other types of wild plant. So I don't think Kenya is a good example. And I think, but I guess the real point I'm making is I just think this is an industry. If we're going to talk about wild foods as a whole, you can't really talk about it with any real substance in East Africa, because it doesn't really exist. And I guess that's the key point. There is such huge potential for it to exist. There is such huge potential for it to be a really useful tool for the sustainable management of wildlife, including plants, flora and fauna. But yet it's not being manifested. It's not happening. And it's not happening primarily because either the regulatory environment doesn't permit it to happen, or there are land tenure situations which make it difficult to manage sustainably and to measure and to control and to regulate. And there is no political appetite to change all that around. And I think that's probably the key thing. I don't think that politicians, and I don't think people living in cities, places like Nairobi, Dar es Salaam, the sort of emerging mega cities, I don't think they really have a clue about this kind of stuff. It's just not on their radar. And therefore, it's not on the political radar. And until such time as we can somehow get it onto the political radar, and so until such time as we can paint the picture of potential that is offered by it, for all of the reasons that I tried to explain, albeit briefly, we're not going to make any progress. This is just not going to happen. And I don't know, I don't know why we can't learn lessons from South Africa. There have been various attempts in the past to take politicians to Botswana, Namibia, South Africa, Zimbabwe, other places in Southern Africa where this is just, an accepted part of the economy. But for some reason, it just hasn't filtered into thinking around the wildlife economy in East and to a large extent, Central Africa. So I don't know the reasons for that, but it's primarily political, and it's primarily because there is no pressure upon the politicians, because I think people have become divorced from the natural world. They live in cities and they don't really understand the opportunity that exists.
Thanks for that, Richard. I see also on the chat box we have some questions and comments as well coming in, and keep them coming. I see one person wants to comment. There's a comment, wants to confirm from you if it is true that 70% of Kenyans consume game meat. I think perhaps he wants to know if that is the correct version of what you said, and perhaps how do you get to know that? Maybe that's is what the person is trying to get to.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, they're making a very good point. I should qualify that slightly. Wild meat. The first point I would make is wild meat can be anything. It can be termites. It can be in the case of Uganda, it can be grasshoppers. It can be anything. So when we talk about people consuming wild meat, we're including all of that. And I think that statistic came from, which I'm happy to supply to you guys for you guys to distribute. It came from an IUCN study that was conducted in Kenya over a period of about 3 or 4 years, approximately 3 years ago. And also, don't forget, you're including all the coastal communities who live off fish, but that's wild meat. So that 70%, maybe to think of it as game meat, sort of illegally imported into Nairobi, it would be hard to it would probably not reach the level of 70%. But if you look at the country as a whole and you include all of those various different categories that I'm talking about, that's the final figure that was arrived at. And you can understand, if you include all of those categories, how that could be the case.
Yeah. So I think the concern was that, is it only meat from the antelopes or something like that? So thank you for clarifying that. And we also have another question coming from Frank there. He says, in countries like Kenya, where wild fish can be harvested and consumed, but not wild mammals, could the laws and regulations for fish use provide some insights for wild mammal use? I can repeat that
at
question
the moment,
if
no.
it's not clear.
Yeah, so just what you're asking is, if I understand the question correctly, the law in Kenya is it's pretty clear. If I can remember it off the top of my head, it basically says that wildlife cannot be killed and consumed. The issue is that you've probably got a badly drafted law where the definition of wildlife is ill-defined. So, and that's really the kind of point that I'm making a little bit here, and it relates back to the previous question. Wildlife, it takes many, many different forms, and we need to be nuanced in our approach to how we make use of that wildlife. We can't just think of it as large mammals. We must think of it as all of the other opportunities that wildlife presents for a sustainable harvesting process that places a value on that wildlife, and where it can be managed and monitored, presents opportunities for investment into the growth of that natural capital. So I think we've got Kenya is an anomaly. They talk about no use of wildlife, and yet, as I've illustrated, there is plenty of use of wildlife. So the law is an ass, frankly, and it needs to be looked at, and it needs to be nuanced, but it needs to be done in a way by people who have great understanding of the potential and the opportunities. And I think that's the real issue at the moment. Those in power don't understand that opportunity. And I keep talking about Kenya, but this is a theme that is repeated in not only Africa, but other parts of the world. And so, we have to break down those barriers somehow or another. And I guess that's part of the reason for doing talks of this type.
Yeah. I see there are many questions coming in, and also if you want to raise your hand, I see Hillary is raising a hand. Hillary, over to you. You can ask your questions.
My husband, who has great experience in wildlife utilization before it was banned, has something to say.
Good morning, everyone, and good morning, Richard. I know Richard for many years when he was the manager of Arpeggiator, was the manager of game ranching in Athi River, which is about 40 kilometers to the east on the Mombasa Road. It's an 8,000 hectare game ranch, and I was manager there for about 6 years and more. And we supplied game meat to various restaurants in Nairobi. I also supplied game meat to cities further away, like Machakos and Mombasa. It was highly successful. Our cropping rate on average was about 10%. With certain species, it was a bit more. Impala, I think it was about 15%. And what is more, I cropped on various ranches around game ranching, about 4 or 5 other ranches, and it was the first time that the ranch owners and the ranch managers ever received any money from their wildlife. And they were absolutely delighted. And we set up the Machakos Wildlife Forum. There were about 20 or 25 landowners and interested parties. We met once a month, discussed quotas, discussed various issues concerning wildlife. So that was then banned.
Why?
I actually, there was going to be a consultancy on game ranching, and I have done about 90 consultancies in my life on forest conservation and wildlife management. And I handed in my application, and it turned out, and I went to KWS headquarters in Nairobi 2 or 3 weeks later, and they told me that my application had been lost very conveniently. So that was that. Then I spent quite some time, 1 or 2 years, on behalf of African Wildlife Foundation, taking Kenyan game wardens down to Zimbabwe to see this very successful campfire projects. It was mainly in the southern part of Zimbabwe towards the South African border.
So just to jump in quickly there, maybe if we can just try to summarize the point, the question, so that we can get the conversation going.
I think it was banned because of a very strong American anti-hunting lobby. And there was a lot of pressure from abroad through wildlife NGOs. And that's why I wanted to discuss or say something about these trips to Zimbabwe. And we had discussions, I had discussions with the Kenyan KWS game wardens, and about 80% were for what they'd seen, and about 20% were against it. And then I asked them, well, why doesn't Kenya emulate or introduce similar projects? And they said it doesn't go past the minister and the politicians.
So yeah, thanks for that, Richard. Any quick comment on that?
Otherwise, I mean, I think that the point Malta is making is a very interesting one. It's for me about the wildlife, the potential of Africa's wildlife economy as a whole. You know, wild food is one thing, but there's plenty of other potential. And we're seeing new financial instruments emerging around carbon sequestration, nature-based solutions, and so on and so forth. There's a pile of money out there, but we've got to make ourselves investable. Right now, we're not investable. Some are, but many places in Africa are uninvestable. You know, as a consequence of that, instead, and particularly in Kenya, but again, this is mirrored in other parts of Africa, we've become reliant upon philanthropic incomes to support our wildlife. It's absolutely crazy. Our wildlife should be our greatest economic asset if it's properly managed. But until such time as it's properly managed, and we as countries enact legislation that allows us to become investable, then that opportunity is never going to be manifested, except for a few exceptions, such as South Africa.
Yeah.
So I think that's the bigger point.
Yeah. So thanks, Richard. Junior, or Hauko, if you are present, you can open your mic and ask your question, or I can also ask this question that you put on the chat. Junior?
Yes, thank you, Wiseman. Actually, I was seeing it from another perspective, but then the discussion have been quite interesting, because my question was to see in Africa, we mostly have, and that I'm talking about West and Central Africa, where we are not that much developed in game reserve, but we mostly have national parks. And in national parks, it's very, like, human intervention is very little, or I would say it's not authorized. So how do we manage, or how do we ensure that there is sustainable consumption of wildlife or wild species, either it be animals, plants, or mushrooms, in those areas which are considered protected or which are considered national parks or wildlife reserves?
Oh, thanks very much, Junior. Where are you from? Just a quick one. Are you
I'm
from Benin?
from Benin, yes, but I'm currently based in Paris.
Which fruit or which
Junior is
wild food? Okay, yes, Richard.
sorry, Wise. Junior is he's a newly joined participant in the conservation MBA that the School of Wildlife Conservation runs. So yeah, I look forward to having these discussions, Junior. But the point is this: ask ourselves the question: why has livestock increased at the expense of wildlife across Africa? I don't know how many times, but basically, if you go to again, I'm going to use the example of Kenya, but livestock populations have increased dramatically over the past 40, 50 years. Wildlife populations have decreased dramatically. And what are the differences between those two things? Well, you can own livestock. It's your asset. You can manage it as you see fit. You can harvest it for profit. You can invest into it. You can build it. You can't do the same with wildlife because of some of the reasons that we talked about. So, I don't think we should be looking at this at the level of national parks. We should be looking at this at the level of the wildlife resource that Africa in large part still retains. And we should be asking ourselves the question, and that question is, how do we make best economic use of this asset? Because if we can make it into an economic asset, you can be sure, just like cattle, it will grow, as it has in places like South Africa. If we don't, it will disappear at the expense of other economic activities. And I'm going to refer you back to the graph that I showed at the beginning, which is that human capital has built at the expense of wildlife. And that essentially is going to be promulgated if we don't change something in the way that we perceive the sort of management of wildlife assets.
Yeah, I see more questions are coming in for you, Richard. I think we'll have enough time to answer all of them, but those that remain will be able also to answer them at a later stage. So there's a question from Andriam Bolomanana. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. He is asking, or she's asking, that what factors are fueling stigmatization against the consumption of wild meat? So it basically is asking, in the region, East Africa region, what are some of the factors or issues that people consider, which makes them to say, no, we don't want to consume meat?
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't think it applies to all people or all situations or all wild products. Honey is a very acceptable wild product, wild food. It's I think it's a cultural thing. It's the perception of modern city dwellers. You don't go to a supermarket, you go into the bush to harvest your vegetables. That potentially stigmatizes the rural people. And there's definitely, and there are studies to show this, that that is an impediment to the adoption of wild foods as a central plank of Africa's nutritional approach. And it doesn't happen everywhere, but it certainly happens in certain areas. So I think the reasons are largely cultural, but also the result of increasing populations living in cities where they are completely almost divorced from the natural world and what it potentially offers.
Would you perhaps also say in the same sentence that perhaps the way conservation has been done in the past could also have an effect into the stigmatization?
100%, 100%. the sort of fortress approach of the past, in the context of the past, where it was thought to be the right thing to be doing, has definitely created an us and them situation. There is the national park, no humans go in there, that's for wildlife. Outside we do different things and it's for humans. Whereas actually what we should be thinking about is sustainable management in the environment that benefits both people and wildlife, and where we find ways to coexist. And by the way, that's possible, but you've got to have political leadership to enable it to happen.
Okay, Ronald online, if you're still here, please unmute yourself and ask the question. Ronald Operica. Are you here, Ronald? Yes, go on. Okay, I think Ronald maybe might have left. So here is the question from Ronald. He's saying, what of a situation where government creates the supply side by doing inventories of their natural and wildlife assets and create products and services that truly drive conservation and protection efforts? So it's a supposed situation, saying what of a situation where government creates the supply side by doing inventories of their natural and wildlife assets. So it's typically of what ALU has done by compiling all these assets and different wildlife resources in different countries, trying to measure investability and availability and so forth. So I think that is the question. Maybe you can comment on that.
Sure. I don't think it's the role of government to manage. I think it's the role of government to provide appropriate incentives and to remove inappropriate disincentives to allow people to make investments to manage. So, you know, if you ask any African government how many cattle they have in their country, I can absolutely 100% guarantee they don't have a clue. How, therefore, they would be expected to be able to support the proper management of the supply side, I think, you know, you wouldn't really expect a government to be able to properly be able to do that. What they should be doing is enacting appropriate legislation, creating the regulatory environment, but then assuming that with reasonable regulation that the market forces will determine what happens. Look at what has happened in South Africa. People have invested into the production of wild meat. With value-add opportunities, and in certain cases, wild plants, not because government has got involved, but because government has provided appropriate incentives, including tax incentives and et cetera, that have persuaded people that this is the best possible use of their land or whatever, primarily their land. And then market forces have done the rest. So I'm not arguing for the unfettered release of market forces because that can take us into all sorts of different directions. But I'm also arguing that government shouldn't be involved in actual management, much more the provision of the appropriate regulatory environment, and probably the management of some of the regulations.
Okay. Yeah, so thanks very much, Richard. We are coming closer to the end of this session, but a quick one. Just to note that you highlighted that in countries like Kenya, for example, the consumption of wild meat is banned. And also, how is the outlook like in the other parts of the region, like Somalia, Rwanda, and so forth? And is there an opportunity that some of these species, particularly the wild meat species, could they be reintroduced? And is there consideration? What is the thinking currently in terms of policy-wise and practice? Is there consideration to reintroduce these based on the evidence that it could potentially regenerate and restore the landscapes?
Well, I mean, the answer is, without looking into it in more detail, I don't really know what is happening in places like Somalia. And you'll look on our map, or with the map I showed earlier, that it's an area which we don't know too much about for obvious reasons. And Somalia is a highly populous country, and it goes back to my point. I think if I told you that I have a cow that can grow faster than your cow, that can produce really high quality meat, that is going to be in demand, that is disease resistant, meaning that you don't have to dip it once a week to prevent it getting diseases from or tick-borne diseases, that is able to defend itself from predators and doesn't need a herder and doesn't need to be brought into a boma at night. And you actually have probably less than 20% of the management inputs to look after this cow than you would have if you were looking after a normal type of cow. And I said to you, I can give that to you, but it's, you know, to replace your current cows. The answer is you would probably think about doing it. Well, that's what wildlife does, and Malta will talk about it more, but there are numerous studies which show the efficiency of wildlife in terms of its ability to produce quality protein in austere conditions faced with numerous challenges without massive management inputs. And so it makes sense economically to use wildlife to do that job for us, as opposed to domestic livestock, which is far more problematic and less productive. And so again, this goes back to my point. If the appropriate incentives are in place, then you would assume that market forces will dictate, will lead to the reintroduction of wildlife. Again, as has happened in places like South Africa, there are areas which had only cattle, which have now got only wildlife. And so, yeah, I think it can happen. But again, it goes back to my point around informed political will. And I think, unfortunately, at this point, that is what is lacking.
Thanks for that. I think we can give it one last person, the one pending question. I think we have a question from Khan Rukera. Khan Rukera, if you are still here, please unmute yourself and ask the question directly. Khan Rukera, this will be our last question for this session. Khan, are you here? Okay, I'll read the Khan's question quickly. In the context of East Africa's wildlife economy, what are the current trends, opportunities, challenges associated with investment? Oh, he's saying his mic is not working. So it's fine. I'll continue reading his question. So, in the context of East Africa's wildlife economy, what are the current trends, opportunities, challenges associated with investment in wildlife meat and other wild products? Specifically, how are regulations, market demand, conservation efforts influencing this sector? What are the sustainable practices that can be implemented to ensure both economic growth and protection of biodiversity? So I think there are multiple levels for this question. So you can just make a comment on it. I think some of the things you've touched on them already. Yes.
It goes back to what I was talking about before. Appropriate incentives to invest in the production of wild food would lead to growth in the value of that opportunity. It would lead, probably, as has been demonstrated in other parts of Africa, to growth in wild populations as a result. And right now, I would just finish by saying, in the East African system, in many areas, I'm probably leaving out Tanzania, but you know, if you're the beneficiary of a wildlife asset, the only way you can really make commercial use of it is through tourism. Well, if you're not in a position or a place where tourism can easily happen, and it's a highly competitive and fickle business, then you act to remove it, because you need to make way in the classical sort of sense of land management for you know, to do something else, grow wheat or something else. And that's really the key point in all of this. The incentives that exist in Eastern Africa in particular to support the sustainable use and growth of wild populations don't exist. Instead, we're faced with a range of disincentives which push people in other directions, and that is what needs to change.
Thank you very much, Richard. And with that, I think that brings us to the end of this conversation. I think everyone could hear what are the insights into East Africa's wildlife economy, particularly looking into wild foods. But it is very clear from the discussion we had that there's still a lot that needs to be done, particularly looking into the legislative environment and also to give permission and incentivize people to be part of this process. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us online and being part of this wonderful series. We're looking forward to seeing you also on the next one, next week on Thursday. We'll be focusing on wild oils. And all the best and enjoy the rest of the week. Bye from me.
Thanks all. Thanks for having me.